This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today I'm continuing my limited review for Strixhaven. So far I've looked at all the monocolored cards in the set, and between today and tomorrow we'll be looking at the remaining cards in the set, multicolored and colorless. This set is all about the various Strixhaven colleges, each of which occupies one of 5 two-color combinations, and as a result, this set has a ton of multicolored cards. Normally, I look at all the multicolored and colorless cards in one video, but this time around I had to divide them into 2 separate videos. Today we'll be looking at Quandrix, Witherbloom, and Lorehold, which are blue-green, black-green, and red-white respectively. Keep in mind that in this review, I'm only talking about the limited formats, that's draft and sealed. I won't be talking about formats like standard or commander. I conclude my evaluation of each of these cards with a letter grade that sort of sums up my thoughts about the card. If you're new to my set reviews, there's an explanation of what each grade means in the description of this video. Alright, let's look at our first multicolored card. We'll be starting with blue-green. First up, it's Aether Helix, which costs 3 generic, a green, and a blue for an uncommon sorcery, and it says return target permanent to its owner's hand. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. I really want to like this card since I love bounce spells and getting stuff back from my graveyard, but I just don't think this is anything special. Bouncing a permanent does not give you a card's worth of value, and you won't even get that much tempo because you're paying 5 for it. And yeah, getting a permanent back is worth the whole card, but this is basically just a 5-mana spell that bounces a permanent and draws a card, which is fine, but it's not that great, especially as a sorcery. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Mathematician, which costs 1 generic, a green, and a blue for a 2/2 human wizard at common. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token, and you put a +1/+1 counter on each fractal you control. A 3-mana 2/2 that makes a 1/1 is generally pretty good and limited, and this comes a significant upside between the +1/+1 counter and the additional value you can get from having other fractals. This seems like a card in the lower range of first pickable and a very strong common, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Body of Research, which costs 3 green and 3 blue for a mythic rare sorcery. It creates a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token. Put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of cards in your library. This card is a cool design, but I don't think it will be a bomb in limited. Mostly, it just gives you a huge vanilla creature, and the spell isn't easy to cast either. Now, a 22/22 can only die to so many things, so this isn't bad, just not a bomb either. I think it's probably a B. Next up, it's Decisive Denial, which costs a green and a blue for an uncommon instant. It says choose one, target creature you control fights target creature you don't control, or counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 3. This is pretty good. Fight cards are always nice and limited, and while the best ones do give some sort of stats boost that helps your creature win combat, this one makes up for not doing that by being a modal card. So, if the fight part on this works as a removal spell for you, you'll probably use it. But if a situation comes up where you can counter your opponent's thing before that, you probably choose the counter option. Neither option here is incredible, but having a choice between them is quite nice. I think this is in the lower range of first pickable. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Double Major, which costs a green and a blue for a rare instant, and it says copy target creature spell you control, except it's legendary if the spell is legendary, or isn't legendary if the spell is legendary. This is cheap enough that I think I can get behind playing it all the time in blue-green decks. Sure, copying your 2/2 won't feel amazing, but it is perfectly fine, and if you can copy your 4-drop with it, you'll be in pretty good shape in terms of what you get in return for your mana. Blue-green is a ramp color pair too, so having the extra mana to do this is reasonably likely. Overall, I still don't think this is amazing. After all, you need to pair it with something else for it to even do anything, but I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Eureka Moment, which costs 2 generic, a green, and a blue for a common instant. It says draw 2 cards. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. This ramps you a bit while drawing you cards, which is fine. A lot of the time, the ability to put lands into play from your hand isn't that great and limited because there comes a point where you just don't have lands to put down. But because this also draws you cards, it does increase the chances that you're actually going to get some ramp out of this. Giving this a C. Next up, it's Fractal Summoning, which costs X and 2 green-blue hybrid mana. It's a common sorcery lesson. It creates a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token. Put X +1/+1 counters on it. So lessons are a new subtype introduced in this set. You can have them in your sideboard, and when you do, you can grab them when you play a card that has Learn. You can also play them in your main deck, which generally I don't recommend unless you don't have any cards with Learn, and some of them are kind of playable in your main deck. This is not one of them, though. This spell will always be inefficient, so that's not really something you want to be having in your main deck. I think it's probably a D there. But it is the kind of card you can grab when you learn that actually adds to the board, and not all of them do that, but Fractal Summoning will. So I think having it as a card to grab for free when you learn makes it a C. Next up, it's Golden Ratio, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue is an uncommon sorcery, and it says draw a card for each different power among creatures you control. So you want this to be at least Divination, and that seems reasonably doable. However, one thing that kind of stinks here is that you can cast Divination on an empty board and still draw 2. That's not going to happen here. Still, it also has way more upside than Divination and will draw you 3+ cards sometimes. It will be really painful to have this in a hand where it's your only 3-drop or something like that, but I think in the late game it will be powerful enough to make up for that. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Kazmina, Enigma Sage, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue is a legendary Planeswalker Kazmina, a mythic rare. She starts with 2 loyalty, and each other Planeswalker you control has her loyalty abilities. Her +2 scries 1, her -X creates a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token, and you put X +1/+1 counters on it. And her -8 searches your library for an instant or sorcery card that shares a color with this Planeswalker. You exile that card and then shuffle, and you can cast that card without paying its mana cost. So obviously, Kazmina's static ability won't come up in Limited basically ever. There are very few Planeswalkers in this set, and they're all mythic rare. Suffice it to say, if you get another Planeswalker with this, you're probably doing pretty well. But even without that part coming up, I like Kazmina a fair bit. She can make creature tokens to protect her, and that's always a really big plus. She does have to lower her loyalty to do it, but it isn't hard to imagine playing her and using her +2 to scry, and then making a 2/2 or 3/3 to protect her on the next turn, and then continuing to alternate. Then obviously, if she's allowed to stick around longer than that, she'll get wacky. It's kind of funny because her static ability and ultimate both aren't very good in Limited, but her other 2 abilities are good enough that I'm going to value her pretty highly, giving her a B. Next up, it's Manifestation Sage, which costs 4 green-blue hybrid mana. It's a 2/2 human wizard at rare, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token, and you put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of cards in your hand. As long as you're getting a 2/2 out of this, you're doing all right, but it isn't like that's incredible. It is solid enough. And sure, there will be times where he makes something even larger, and then you'll feel pretty good, but there will also be times when you draw this in top deck mode and get no token at all. I don't think he's terrible, but I think it's hard enough to make a big token that he's not amazing. I'm giving him a B-. Next up, it's Needlethorn Drake, which for a green and a blue is a 1/1 Drake at common with flying and death touch. This can attack in the air early, and then stay back to trade with anything late. Like most cheap death touch creatures, this is solid. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Quandrick's Apprentice, which for a green and a blue is a 2/2 human wizard at uncommon. It's got Magecraft, and that means it does something when you cast or copy an instant or sorcery. In this case, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, reveal a land from among them, and put that card into your hand, and put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This kind of effect is pretty nice, especially in the early game when you really need to hit your land drops. Either way, this will draw you a card most of the time when you play a spell, and even if it's always a land, that's a pretty big bonus to add to all of your spells. As we've seen, blue-green also has lots of lands, so this is a big enabler for that deck. I think this can be first pickable some of the time. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Quandrick's Command, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue is a rare instant, and it says choose 2. Return target creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand. Counter target artifact or enchantment spell. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, or target player shuffles up to 3 target cards from their graveyard into their library. This has 2 options you'll choose more than the others in Limited, while the other 2 are just some nice, narrow additional upside. Here, I think you'll choose the bounce option and the +1/+1 counter option most of the time. Those 2 things can really make things go awry for your opponent. All of a sudden, you've bounced their best attacker or blocker, and you've pumped one of your creatures so it can win combat. That's pretty nice. Then sometimes you'll also get to counter and bounce if your opponent plays the right permanent type for you to counter it, but there aren't a ton of artifacts and enchantments in this set. The shuffle effect will probably go unused when you draft this, but I guess it could occasionally be useful. I think you can first pick this. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Quandrick's Cultivator, which costs 1 generic, a green-blue hybrid mana, and 1 blue mana, and it's a 3/4 Turtle Druid at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest or island, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. This is some nice ramp, and it comes on a fairly reasonable body. Casting this is going to feel pretty good on turn 4, and like some other ramp creatures, it brings decent stats when you play it in the late game. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Quandrick's Pledge Mage, which costs 1 generic and 2 green-blue hybrid mana. It's a 2/2 Merfolk Druid at common, and it's got Magecraft, and it gains a +1/+1 counter. We see this type of card a lot, though lately it has mostly been red. Either way, this kind of creature tends to grow fairly rapidly in a deck with a decent number of spells. It is certainly vulnerable at first, but if your opponent doesn't take it down when they can, it can get quite impressive, giving this a C+. Next, there's Square Up, which costs 1 generic and 1 green-blue hybrid mana for a common instant, and it says target creature has base power and toughness 4/4 until end of turn. This kind of card never really comes through. You can sort of treat it like a trick, but it's just too situational to be reliable in that capacity. I guess kind of the idea is to use this on a Fractal token, which has base power 0/0, so it kind of gives it +4/+4, and then you add in the +1/+1 counters, and that seems kind of cute, but overall I don't think you play this. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Tanazir Quandrix, who for 3 generic, a green, and a blue is a 4/4 Elder Dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, it's got trample. When it enters the battlefield, you double the number of +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, and when it attacks, you may have the base power and toughness of other creatures you control become equal to Tanazir Quandrix's power and toughness until end of turn. A 5-mana 4/4 with Flample is already a good deal, and then Quandrix has 2 pretty nice abilities. His Enter the Battlefield ability doubles counters, and sometimes, like with most Fractals, that'll be incredible. Other times you'll get like 1 counter, or maybe even none, but because the baseline here is so reasonable, that's perfectly fine. Then when Quandrix attacks, he will generally upgrade your whole board. This pays you off a bit for putting counters on Quandrix, since the bigger he is, the more formidable that is. This Elder Dragon is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next, it's Zimone, Quandrix Prodigy, which for a green and a blue is a 1/2 legendary human wizard at uncommon. You can pay 1 generic and tapper to put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, or you can pay 4 generic and tapper to draw a card. If you control 8 or more lands, you draw 2 cards instead. So, as I've said about other effects like this, Zimone's first ability is the kind that is often overrated and limited. Sure, if you have the extra land, she will ramp you early, and that's nice. Thing is, you tend to run out of extra lands to play in a hurry in limited, so she is going to do this once, and only if you get her early, really. Her draw effect is what's the most intriguing to me. Just being able to pay 4 for a single card is a great mana sink, and in the late game when she starts drawing you 2, she's likely to just win you the game. She is small and easy to kill, but she only costs 2 mana, so it's not going to be completely backbreaking if your opponent kills her. I'm giving her a B. Now we're going to move to the Quandrix double-faced modal cards. Remember, with these double-faced modal cards, they don't transform like more traditional double-faced cards. You choose one side to cast, and that's what the card is when it comes into play or when it's put on the stack. In this case, you have Augmenter Pugilist, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 3/3 Troll Druid at rare. It's got trample, and as long as you control 8 or more lands, it gets +5/+5. The other side is Echoing Equation, a sorcery that costs 3 generic and 2 blue, and it says choose target creature you control. Each other creature you control becomes a copy of it until end of turn, except those creatures aren't legendary if the chosen creature is legendary. Both sides of this have their place. The Pugilist side is far less situational, since it's just an efficient creature, and one that gets really scary in the late game. But sometimes you want to cast the Echoing Equation side of things. You pretty much only do that when you can swing for lethal with it, though, and it will sometimes do that for you. Mostly, you will play the Pugilist. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Jadzi, Oracle of Arcavios, which for 6 generic and 2 blue is a 5/5 human wizard legendary at Mythic Rare. You can discard a card to return it to your hand, and her Magecraft trigger lets you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a non-land card, you can cast it by paying 1 generic mana rather than paying its mana cost, and if it's a land, you put it onto the battlefield. The other side is Journey to the Oracle, which costs 2 generic and 2 green for a sorcery, and it says you may put any number of land cards from your hand onto the battlefield. Then if you control 8 or more lands, you may discard a card. If you do, return Journey to the Oracle to its owner's hand. Jadzi might cost a lot of mana, but she doesn't disappoint. Her Magecraft ability lets you cast something off the top of your deck for 1 mana. Just triggering that once will often be quite good. And note, by the way, that you can chain them together if you happen to hit 2 instants and sorceries in a row, for example. Now, she doesn't have any evasion to speak of, and can't really end the game on her own. But at least she can return to your hand to protect her if necessary, although paying 8 mana over and over again doesn't seem that appealing. She does give you a lot of mana back pretty quickly once you trigger Magecraft. The other side of Jadzi, though, is not the most impressive thing ever. It's just hard to have enough lands in your hand and limited for that to ever be the plan. It is cool that you get to put it back in your hand when you cast it, which means you can then play the Jadzi half later. But overall, the fact she needs some help to get going and costs a bunch of mana does make me a bit skeptical, especially because Journey to the Oracle is almost useless and limited. Worth noting that both blue-green and blue-red look like they will have lots of mana, and that's good news for Jadzi. Still, I think her mana cost is enough of a hurdle that I can't really give her more than a B, with the caveat that, obviously, if you can cast her, she's going to take over the game. Next up, it's Kian, Dean of Substance, which costs 2 generic and a green for a rare Elf Druid legendary. You can tap it to exile the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you put it into your hand. Otherwise, you put a study counter on it. You can also pay 4 generic and a green to create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token, and you put an additional counter on it for each different mana value among non-land cards you own in exile, with study counters on them. The other side is Imbraham, Dean of Theory, who costs 2 generic and 2 blue for a 3/3 legendary bird wizard, rare. It's got flying. You can pay X generic and 2 blue and tap it to exile the top X cards of your library and put a study counter on each of them. Then you may put a card you own in exile with a study counter on it into your hand. This Dean cycle is really good in general. Each of these sides would be good if it was just that all the time. Even if all Kian was a 3-mana 2/2 with that first ability, the one that draws you a card if your top card is a land, that would be like a B-. Her other ability actually gives you some nice value for not hitting land, since it means she can churn out bigger fractal tokens in the later part of the game, though it should be noted her ability is so expensive that you're not really going to be creating efficient fractal tokens very often. I would imagine she's making 2/2s and 3/3s for the most part, but still, it's a good mana sink. Meanwhile, Imbraham is a 4-mana 3/3 flyer, an always good card in limited, and then he also has a powerful activated ability that can draw you cards. Even if you just pay 1 generic and 2 blue, he basically draws you a card. If you pay more than that, he gives you great card selection, and one kind of cool thing about him is if you paid a bunch for him earlier in the game, you can just pay 2 blue and tap him to still get one of the cards you exiled in one of the earlier activations. Overall, I think this is a bomb. I think Imbraham is probably the more powerful one that's going to really take over games, but having the flexibility of also being able to play Kian is quite nice. I'm giving this an A-. So we're also going to look at Mystical Archive cards in this video. Each color pair has 1 in this set. We've already seen all the monocolored Mystical Archive cards. Remember, these are a special set of reprints, and 1 card from the Mystical Archive appears in every single Strixhaven booster pack. And the blue-green one is Growth Spiral, which costs a green and a blue for a rare instant. It says draw a card. You may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. This card was so good it had to be banned out of Standard, but it's not that great in Limited. If you played early, it's pretty good since it could often help you ramp a bit, but the problem, as I've said, with these play more lands type cards in Limited is that there comes a certain point where you just don't have more lands to play. And even with a cantrip attached to it, it won't always be that great. Now, like all the cantrips in a set with Magecraft, it does get a bit of an upgrade, and its worst case scenario is still that it replaces itself, and early, it feels really good. I don't really imagine cutting the first couple of copies of these from blue-green decks. You're not going to get that many because it's a rare, but still, I'm giving it a C+. And now, we're moving ahead to Witherbloom, where we're beginning with the Elder Dragon, who is Beledros Witherbloom, who for 5 generic, a black and a green, is a 4/4 legendary Elder Dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, and it says at the beginning of each upkeep, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life, and you can also pay 10 life to untap all your lands, but you can only activate it once a turn. You know, for an Elder Dragon, I gotta say, I'm not ultra impressed. I think he's the worst of this cycle. He's still a good card, but he's not quite as good as the others. 7 mana for a 4/4 flyer is a rough rate, and while getting a 1/1 pest every upkeep, which, by the way, includes your opponent's upkeep, while getting those tokens is nice, the other ability on this card will basically never come up in Limited. There just won't be a reason to use all that mana by the time Beledros is out there. Now, I don't think he's bad. Left unchecked, he floods the board with pests and attacks pretty hard in the air, but he's also very fragile at only 4 toughness. Lots of stuff that's cheaper than him can just kill him. Generally, you will get at least 1 pest out before he dies, so there is that. He's still quite good, but I do think he falls short of being a bomb. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Blood Researcher, which for 1 generic, a black and a green, is a 2/2 vampire druid at common. It's got menace, and whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. This is a nice common payoff for gaining life, which is the main archetype for black-green. It may not be quite as cheap as a Johnny's Pride Mate, but it adds menace to the mix, and I think that's a fair trade. I think this is first pickable in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next, it's Cram Session, which for 1 generic and 1 green-black hybrid mana is a common sorcery. You gain 4 life, and it has Learn, which lets you grab a lesson out of your sideboard or rummage. You have a choice. So yeah, black-green has a lot of life gain payoffs, as we've seen already in this video and throughout the week, and as we're going to continue to see in this video. So a card like Cram Session is a little bit better than it would normally be, I think. Although, I still don't think it's that great. It's mostly going to feel like a bad Revitalize, and Revitalize isn't that great to begin with. It is probably worth putting in the life gainiest of decks, but I have a hard time seeing it as more than a D+. Next up, it's Culling Ritual, which costs 2 generic, a black, and a green for a rare sorcery. It says destroy each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less. Add black or green for each permanent destroyed this way. This is kind of a strange card for Limited. Most decks have a reasonable number of cards that will be able to be destroyed by this, and one cool thing here is that you get mana back, even if your permanents get destroyed, and that softens the blow a bit if there's some collateral damage. But there will be board states where this either hits you more than your opponent or doesn't make any difference, since it's so focused only on killing really low mana cost things. Now, this format does have a reasonable number of creature tokens, more than a normal set does, and I think that probably makes it a little better. But this is hard to figure out. I think it will have enough things it can blow up that it's an okay card, but this is the kind of card where I wouldn't be surprised if I was wrong in either direction. I'm giving it a C+ for now. Next up, it's Demogoth Titan, which costs 4 green-black hybrid mana for an 11/10 demon at rare, and whenever it attacks or blocks, you sacrifice a creature. This guy's not awesome. He's huge, but he can also be chump blocked forever, and that really matters here because you'll only be able to sacrifice so many of your creatures to let this guy rumble, and you also have to do it when he blocks, so it isn't like he's an amazing defensive creature either. Even with pest tokens around, I think he's just a C. Next up, it's Demogoth Woe Eater, which costs 1 generic, a black, 1 green-black hybrid mana, and 1 green mana for a 7/6 demon at uncommon. At the beginning of your upkeep, you sacrifice a creature, and when you sacrifice Demogoth Woe Eater, each opponent discards a card, you draw a card, and you gain 2 life. This is a neat design. Obviously, the stats are massive for the cost, but having to sacrifice a creature every turn can be a little rough. You'll need some expendable things around to make that worth it, and pest tokens do provide that for you. What makes this better than a card like the Titan, though, is the good news is, even if you end up not having something worth sacrificing and just have to play Demogoth on an empty board, you'll still get some value back when you sacrifice it to its own ability. Gaining 2 life and forcing your opponent to discard something while you gain life and draw a card isn't incredible for 4 mana, but Demogoth probably also deterred an attack for a turn because of the huge body, and I think that whole package is pretty okay for 4 mana. I think the fail case here is pretty good, and the upside of having such an early 7/6 sounds pretty nice, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Deadly Brew, which costs 1 black and 1 green for an uncommon sorcery. Each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. If you sacrificed a permanent this way, you may return another permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. This is a cool take on an edict effect. You basically take down an opposing creature and one of your own, and you also get a permanent from your graveyard back to your hand. It won't always be easy to set this up. Edict effects are notoriously inconsistent, but most of the time you'll probably come out ahead when you cast this, especially if you have creature tokens and stuff like that. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Dina, Soul Steeper, which costs 1 black and 1 green for a 1/3 legendary Dryad Druid at uncommon. Whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life, and you can pay 1 generic and sacrifice another creature, and she gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. This is a very powerful signpost uncommon for black-green that tells you everything that it's about. It's about gaining life, and it's about sacrificing creatures, especially pest tokens. And that's kind of the ideal thing to do with her ability, because you're going to drain your opponent with Dina in play, plus the life gain effect. In addition to also raising her power, and she can also just potentially threaten a bunch of damage when she attacks, which is always a nice thing to make your opponent contend with. I think she's really good, giving her a B. Next up, it's Harness Infinity, which costs 1 generic, 3 black, and 3 green for a mythic rare instant, and it says exchange your hand in graveyard, exile Harness Infinity. So if you cast this in a game of Limited, you're probably just going to win. It's an instant, so you can leave mana up for other stuff without having to completely tap out to load up your hand, which makes you less vulnerable. That's especially good because you can also get around having to discard to 7 if you cast it at the end of your opponent's turn, giving you as many options as possible. Now, there are downsides here. First, the aforementioned challenging mana cost, as well as the fact that this is pretty much utterly useless until the very late game. Those are the kind of things that keep it from being a great card, but it doesn't have a ton of power, so I'm going to be willing to take it pretty highly. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Infuse with Vitality, which costs 1 black and 1 green for a common instant. It says until end of turn, target creature gains Death Touch, and when this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. You gain 2 life. This is a nice trick, one that virtually guarantees your creature will both kill whatever it is in combat with and survive. Well, technically your creature can still die, of course, but it will come back right away anyway, so it basically doesn't. Incidental life gain tacked on helps out black-green with its life gain synergies too. Now, as good of a trick as this is, it is still a trick and still highly situational and risky, but this one is good enough and efficient enough that I think the first copy is a C+. Next up, it's Muldering Carrock, which for 2 generic, a black, and a green is a 3/3 zombie crocodile at common, and it's got trample and lifelink. Even with trample and lifelink, 4 mana 3/3 isn't awesome, though it is an admittedly good place to put things that pump its stats. Still, I think you probably cut this more often than you play it. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Mortality Spear, which for 2 generic, a black, and a green is an uncommon instant. It costs 2 less to cast if you gained life this turn, and it destroys a non-land permanent. This is excellent. Even if it was always 4 mana to destroy a non-land permanent, it would be great. But this will frequently cost only 2 mana, which is just absurd. This is one of the best uncommons in the set. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Pest Summoning, which for 1 generic and 2 green-black mana is a common sorcery lesson. And you create 2 1/1 black and green pest creature tokens with, whenever this creature dies, you gain 1 life. This is an interesting lesson to look at overall, because I think it's one you can actually play in your main deck and not feel terrible about, especially because black-green likes gaining life and sacrificing things, and this enables all of that. Now, if you have cards with Learn, having this be in your sideboard is almoast always going to be better, but if you end up with like 3 or 4 copies of this, I don't actually think playing a few of them would be a bad idea in your main deck. I think they're probably a C- in your main deck, and a C+ is a card you can grab out of your sideboard. Next up, it's Rust Rebirth, which for 1 black and 1 green is a rare instant. It says choose target creature. When that creature dies this turn, search your library for a creature card with lesser mana value, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. This kind of effect always seems to disappoint in Limited. It's hard to make things line up right exactly how you want them to. Using this on a creature that's going to get removed will feel fine, but even that is just a 2 for 2 and nothing crazy. I'm not really expecting big things from this. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Tend the Pest, which for 1 black and 1 green is an uncommon instant, and it says as an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice a creature, create X 1/1 black and green pest creature tokens with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. This actually seems pretty sweet, and it's kind of interesting to compare to Rust Rebirth because they're pretty similar cards. One of the key differences, though, is that Tend the Pest kills the creature for you, so you don't have to wait for the situation to present itself for the card to really do something. You can just make it happen whenever you want, and that is a huge difference. Now, using it in response to removal and stuff like that will feel especially good, but it won't feel as bad to use in other situations either. Now, the downside it has that Rust Rebirth doesn't have is that the creature has to be kind of sizable for the mana investment here to really be worth it. Rust Rebirth does its thing no matter what size the creature is, although, you get a weaker creature, the weaker the creature you sacrifice or the weaker the creature that dies is. But still, overall, I think Tend the Pest is just going to be better. Those tokens are going to be especially valuable in a deck that cares about gaining life and sacrificing things, so I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Witherbloom Apprentice, which for a black and a green is a 2/2 human druid at uncommon. It's got Magecraft, and it drains your opponent 1 life. A 2-mana 2/2 that drains the opponent every time you play or copy an instant or sorcery is a solid deal, especially because black-green can take advantage of that life gain. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Witherbloom Command, which for a black and a green is a rare sorcery, and it says choose 2. Target player mills 3 cards, then you return a land card from your graveyard to your hand. Destroy target non-creature, non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less. Target creature gets -3/-1 until end of turn, or target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Like the other commands, this can do a bunch of things, but I think this one is probably the worst of the cycle, and I kind of feel bad for Witherbloom because I think they got the worst Elder Dragon, and I think they also got the worst command. It still isn't a bad card, mind you, just not something amazing either. I know this card is cheap, but all of the options on it are pretty underwhelming. Draining the opponent for 2 can trigger some of your life gain stuff. Destroying a non-creature, non-land permanent with a converted mana cost of 2 or less will come up very rarely. This set has very few artifacts or enchantments, for example. And the mill plus return land effect doesn't seem that great either, although it does make sure, most likely anyway, that you're going to hit a land drop. The best effect is the -3/-1 effect, which has a reasonable shot at killing something if it's small enough, but keep in mind this is a sorcery, so you can't really use this to kill anything but X1s. Sure, you can use it to make it so an opposing creature isn't as good of a blocker and stuff like that, but it's not that impressive, honestly. I mean, if you choose the mill option, it is kind of like 2 mana for -3/-1 draw and draw a card, and that's not bad, but it isn't that good either. Blowing up some 2 converted mana cost or less permanent and doing the -3/-1 would feel good, but as I said, you're just not going to have targets. You will always play this in black-green, but I don't really think you should take it that highly. It's basically just a narrow removal spell with some minor upside. I think that makes it a C+. Next up, it's Witherbloom Pledge Mage, which costs 3 generic and 2 black-green hybrid mana for a 5/5 Treefolk Warlock at common, and whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, you gain 1 life. This is pretty good stats and a solid Magecraft trigger. Black-green likes to gain life, so it will fit in well there. I think this is a C. Now let's move to the double-phased modal cards for black-green. First up, we have Blex Vexing Pest, who for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 legendary pest at Mythic Rare. Other pests, bats, insects, snakes, and spiders you control get +1/+1, and when it dies, you gain 4 life. The other side is Search for Blex, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a sorcery, and you look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put any number of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. You lose 3 life for each card you put into your hand this way. Both sides of this are pretty good. The Blex side will often pump a handful of creatures in your deck without really trying because of pest tokens. There aren't a lot of bats, insects, snakes, and spiders in this set. In fact, I'm pretty sure there's only 1 bat and none of those other things, so keep that in mind. It's not going to be pumping much more than pest tokens. But the baseline here is a 3 mana 3/2 that gains you 4 life when it dies, and that's a nice card. Most of the time, you'll just be casting Blex, but sometimes you'll find yourself in a situation where you really need to dig deep into your library for something, and Search for Blex can do that for you. It can potentially just draw you 5 cards, provided you're willing to pay 15 life anyway. Black-green does have lots of ways to gain life, so paying 6 or 9 for this probably isn't completely insane, and you'll probably hit a couple of lands, so that's probably all you want to pay anyway. So it's a pretty good draw spell, even if it is painful. Both sides of this are powerful in the right situation, giving this a B+. Next up, it's Pestilent Cauldron, which for 2 generic and a black is a rare artifact. You can tap it and discard a card to create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. You can also pay 1 and tap it, and each opponent mills cards equal to the amount of life you gain this turn. You can pay 4 generic and tap it to exile 4 target cards from a single graveyard and draw a card. The other side is Restorative Burst, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a sorcery, and you return up to 2 target creature, land, and or planeswalker cards from your graveyard to your hand, and each player gains 4 life. Exile Restorative Burst. The artifact side on this is a nice little Swiss Army knife. Turning lands you draw into pests in the late game isn't too bad, and sometimes you may even be able to mill your opponent a significant amount if you're gaining life. The card draw effect is probably the best of the abilities, but it does ask for cards in graveyards to make it work, and the other 2 abilities can fuel that to some degree. How good this is will be really dependent on the speed of this format, but I can see it grinding out some wins. The restorative boon side is also pretty good. Sure, your opponent gets to gain the life too, but you come out ahead because you're getting stuff back from your graveyard. Overall, I think the whole package here is pretty good. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Valentin, Dean of the Vein, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 legendary vampire warlock at rare. It's got menace and lifelink, and if a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, you exile it instead. Whenever you do, you may pay 2 colorless mana. If you do, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. The other side is Lizette, Dean of the Root, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 legendary human druid at rare. And whenever you gain life, you may pay 1 mana. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and those creatures gain trample until end of turn. This is another really great pair of Deans, and maybe the best in the cycle. They're all pretty close. Both sides of this give you a great baseline with powerful text boxes. Valentin can come down on turn 1 and really start the race out in your favor thanks to menace and lifelink. And then the ability to pay mana to get a 1/1 every time an opposing creature dies is huge upside. Meanwhile, Lizette requires some building around, but not a ton. Black-green has a lot of life gain. And granting your whole board +1/+1 counters and trample is going to be impactful on just about any board state, especially because she gets the boost too. I think Lizette alone is pretty close to a bomb in this format, and because she has the upside of also being Valentin in the early game, I think this is definitely a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Our Mystical Archive card for black-green is Putrefy, which is a rare instant that costs 1 generic, a black, and a green, and it says destroy target artifact or creature. It can't be regenerated. This is a great removal spell that can kill 2 types of permanents at instant speed and efficiently. Not much more to say there, other than that you should take this pretty highly. I'm giving it a B. Alright, let's move now to Lorehold. First up, we have Blade Historian, which costs 4 red-white hybrid mana for a 2/3 human cleric at rare, and it says attacking creatures you control have double strike. So this is a 2/3 with double strike when it attacks, and making your whole board gain double strike on the attack is great, especially because it will mean most of the time the turn it comes down, it will immediately make a difference on the board, improving attacks or allowing attacks that weren't even a good idea before. The mana cost might look kind of challenging, but if you're in a red-white deck, it's actually easier to cast than it would be otherwise. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Hofri Ghostforge, which for 3 generic, a red and a white is a 4/5 dwarf cleric legendary at mythic rare, and spirits you control get +1/+1 and have trample and haste. It says, whenever another non-token creature you control dies, exile it. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a spirit in addition to its other types, and it has, when this creature leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to your graveyard. Well, this is great. While it may not have any fancy keyword abilities or a super efficient body on its own, it makes up for that with the fact that it will immediately make your board a lot scarier in most cases. This can happen as a result of having spirits in play already, and you often will in red-white, but even if you don't, this suddenly makes trading with your creatures or even blocking small ones in combat a nightmare for your opponent, since they'll just come back in buffed up spirit form. The same is true if you're the one on defense. It will utterly warp games around it and help you whether you are ahead or behind, and those are the hallmarks of an amazing bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Lorehold Apprentice, which for a red and a white is a 2/2 human cleric at uncommon, and it's got Magecraft, and it makes your spirit creatures gain tap. This creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. This seems like kind of a weird Magecraft trigger, but it actually seems like it will work pretty well in red-white, which has the ability to make spirit tokens, in addition to the fact that it just has, a bunch of spirits in it. And if you can suddenly tap all of your spirits to do 1 to your opponent, things could get really out of hand for your opponent in a hurry. Just trigger this twice with like 3 spirits in play, and that's a ton of damage. I think this is sometimes good enough to take with the first pick. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Lorehold Command, which costs 3 generic, a red, and a white for a rare instant, and it says choose to create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. Creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain indestructible and haste until end of turn. Lorehold Command deals 3 damage to any target. Target player gains 3 life. Sacrifice a permanent, then draw 2 cards. I think this is the best of this set's command cycle. This is partly because, unlike the other cards in it, it has 4 options that are all actually useful. 5 mana for the Lightning Helix itself isn't terrible. It would be like a C-. Then you add all these other options, and you really have something sweet. You can really look at this as a 5 mana 3/2 creature with flash and an inter-battlefield ability that Lightning Helix is something. Once you look at it that way, it becomes clear that this is very powerful. And it even has those 2 other options, which are sometimes going to come up. Giving up a permanent to draw some cards is sometimes nice in the late game, and obviously the board pump and indestructibility effect will be backbreaking for your opponent sometimes too. I'm tempted to give this a straight up bomb grade, but I do think it falls a little bit short. I'm going to give it a B+. Next up, it's Lorehold Excavation, which for a red and a white is an uncommon enchantment. It says at the beginning of your end step, mill a card. If a land was milled this way, you gain 1 life. Otherwise, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you can pay 5 generic mana and exile a creature from your graveyard to create a tapped 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. This one was my preview card, and I was pretty excited to have it. It seems like a pretty key card for the red-white decks, as it helps you load your graveyard and then can also use the graveyard as a resource by churning out spirit tokens. While it is a little awkward that it doesn't impact the board immediately, it does only cost 2, and at least it starts doing damage and gaining you life right away, and in the extreme late game, it may actually impact the board right away because you might be able to play it and then make a spirit token. And the damage and life gain part of it will feel sort of like Ill-Gotten Inheritance, but with more upside. If you're in red-white and you're playing this seems like the kind of glue that will keep that whole deck together. I'm not sure it does quite enough on its own to pull you into that color pair itself, but if you're there already, you should value it very highly. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Lorehold Pledge Mage, which for 1 generic and 2 red-white hybrid mana is a 2/2 core shaman at common with first strike, and it has Magecraft, and it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. I like this a lot. Players will have a very difficult time ever wanting to block this, since any instant or sorcery suddenly makes things a lot harder thanks to first strike, and that's especially true if you have a trick. This will just get through a lot for aggressive decks, and that's kind of what you want your creatures to be doing. It also has hybrid mana, making it fit in multiple decks pretty easily. I'm giving it a B-. You can first pick it sometimes. Next up, it's Make Your Mark, which for a red-white hybrid mana is a common instant, and it says target creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. When that creature dies this turn, create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. This is kind of a neat trick. It doesn't give that good of a stats boost, and the stats boost it gives won't always help your creature win combat, but that said, your creature doesn't really have to win combat with this all the time for it to really work out for you. After all, you get a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token if that creature dies. Ideally, you kill your opponent's creature and get the 3/2. That's what's going to feel great. But if you're using this more defensively, like to block and then use this and then get a 3-2 to keep something on the board, you're kind of paying 1 mana to fog 1 creature and get a 3-2 red and white spirit creature token, which is a pretty good rate. Now, of course, it's a trick, it's situational, it's got problems, but I think it's a pretty solid trick that'll slot well into both black-white and red-white. I think I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Quintorius, Field Historian, who for 3 generic, a red, and a white is a 2/4 legendary Elephant Cleric and uncommon. It gives your spirits +1/+0, and whenever one or more cards leaves your graveyard, you get a 3-2 red and white spirit creature token. This is an amazing payoff for the red-white deck. That deck cares about taking things out of the graveyard and will easily get the 3-2 thing, and it has a bunch of spirits, including the spirits that Quintorius himself makes. Now, it's kind of a bummer. He doesn't give you any value really all on his own. You need to get something else going to make those spirits, but once you do, he's going to be an insane value engine. I do think the fact that he doesn't have self-contained power holds him back some, but I still think he's a great card, giving him a B. Next up, it's Radiant Scroll Wielder, which for 2 generic, a red, and a white is a 2/4 dwarf cleric at rare. Instant and sorcery spells you control have lifelink, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you exile an instant or sorcery card at random from your graveyard. You may cast it this turn. If a spell cast this way would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. This requires a little bit of setup, namely that you should have a good number of instants and sorceries, and especially ones that do damage because of the lifelink part, but that's not going to be hard in this format, which has an inordinate number of those. If you can get this to rebuy just 1 spell, it will feel pretty good. And once you get the second, you have a bona fide engine on your hands. While this is probably a bit of a build around, I think you'll be able to do enough with it in most decks that it's just going to be really good for red-white, and you should take it pretty highly. It is a little fragile and unimpressive on its own, but it's close to a bomb. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Reconstruct History, which for 2 generic, a red, and a white is an uncommon sorcery. And it says return up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target enchantment, up to 1 target instant, up to 1 target sorcery, and up to 1 target planeswalker from your graveyard to your hand. Exile Reconstruct History. This has a cool design, and it's definitely going to be an achievement unlocked moment when you actually get all of these things back. I mean, getting the planeswalker will be a little hard, but, getting all the rest will be pretty fun. The thing we have to ask ourselves, though, is how many things do you need to get back with this for it to be worth playing? I think if you're getting 2 things back, you're doing okay, and if you're doing 3 or more, you're doing quite well. Red-White does do a reasonable job of loading the graveyard in this format, and I think being able to mill 3 cards will be very doable, and 3+ is obtainable. Your deck will need to have a mix of card types to maximize this, but the good news is that I think your deck will end up with a reasonable mix pretty naturally. In red-white, this is probably the kind of card you basically always want one of. It will give you some nice late-game punch. Having more than one is a bit of a risk because you really don't want it early. Still, I think the first copy looks pretty good. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Relic Sloth, which costs 3 generic, a red, and a white for a 4/4 beast at common with Vigilance and Menace. This isn't that far from being Sarah Angel, right? I mean, Menace is basically flying. Okay, I am exaggerating a little bit here, but kind of to make a point. This is a pretty good French vanilla creature, and while it costs 5, I imagine it makes the cut a lot of the time. Seems like a C. Next up, it's Returned Past Caller, which for 3 generic, a red-white hybrid mana, and 1 white mana is a 4/2 Spirit Cleric at uncommon, and it has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you return a spirit, instant, or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. This is really good. Red-white in this set, as we've seen, is about the graveyard, so this will generally have no problem returning one of these things. It does only have 2 toughness, so it dies to a lot, but because you return something, that still means you're getting a 2-for-1, and if your opponent can't deal with it, it actually hits pretty hard in the air. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Rip Apart, which for a red and a white is an uncommon sorcery, and it says choose 1. Rip Apart deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, or destroy target artifact or enchantment. This is premium removal. 2 mana for 3 damage at sorcery speed already gets you there, but this adds a decent modal effect to deal with problem permanence. Although, as I've said, there aren't a ton of artifacts or enchantments here, it is nice having a card that can deal with the few that there are. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Spirit Summoning, which for 1 generic and 2 red-white hybrid mana is a common sorcery lesson. It creates a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. You don't really want to play this in your main deck, even with spirit synergies. It's just super inefficient, but it will be nice to grab if you have some Learn in your deck. I'm going to say it's a D+ if you have to play it in your main deck, and a C+ is a card to grab when you Learn. Next, it's Stonebound Mentor, which for 1 generic, a red and a white is a 3/3 Spirit Advisor at common, and whenever 1 or more cards leaves your graveyard, you scry 1. This has solid stats and a solid ability. As we've seen, red-white has ways to exile cards from the graveyard and remove them from the graveyard in various other ways. This will trigger the Scry here, which is fine. This is a solid card, giving it a C. Next, it's Thrilling Discovery, which for a red and a white is a common sorcery. It says you gain 2 life, then you may discard 2 cards. If you do, draw 3. I really want this to be good because I'm probably the most excited about Lorehold in this set, but I just don't think it'll be that great. Frequently, you won't be interested in using this card because of the card quality, and then by the later part of the game, when you might be willing to pitch 2 cards for 3 new ones, you just won't have the cards in hand to pitch to it. This seems like it'll be pretty nice to cast early. I mean, sometimes you won't have the cards to discard, but casting it early, improving your card quality, and loading up your graveyard for all your Lorehold synergies seems pretty good. Late, it is going to be a little bit of a liability. Drawing this when you have nothing in your hand is going to hurt a lot. And even early, sometimes you just won't want to cast it because you're happy with the cards in your hand. So it's a bit of an awkward card. I do see it as being a pretty good common for setting up Lorehold things. So if you're like a really synergistic graveyardy Lorehold deck, it's probably worth playing. Probably a C-, but you probably also cut it a lot. Next up, it's Velomancus Lorehold, who for 5 generic, a red and a white is a 5/5 legendary Elder Dragon at Mythic Rare. It has flying, vigilance, and haste. And when it attacks, you look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may cast an instant or sorcery with mana value less than or equal to Velomancus Lorehold's power from among them without paying its mana cost. Put the rest at the bottom of your library in a random order. This costs a lot, but it does enough at that mana cost to be a bomb anyway. The keywords are nice and will enable it to attack the turn it comes down, meaning you'll probably get a free spell out of it even if your opponent untaps and kills him. And by then, the value Velomancus will give you will be plenty. And then if they don't kill him, he'll dominate the skies, both as an attacker and a blocker, thanks to flying and vigilance. This is an A. Next up, it's Venerable Warsinger, which for 1 generic, a red and a white is a 3/3 Spirit Cleric at rare. It's got Vigilance and Trample. And when it deals combat damage to a player, you may return target creature card with converted mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, where X is the amount of damage Venerable Warsinger dealt to that player. This is a good card. A 3 mana for a 3/3 with Vigilance and Trample is already a card you always play. Then you factor in the ability to reanimate creatures directly to the board, and you end up with something incredibly strong. It doesn't have incredible size, and you won't always be able to reanimate stuff with it, but I think you'll be able to often enough that this is something that is pretty great. I'm giving it a B+. Now we're moving to the modal double-face cards for red-white. First, it's Flame Scroll Celebrant, which costs 1 generic and a red for a 2/1 human shaman at rare. Whenever an opponent activates an ability that isn't a mana ability, it deals 1 damage to that player, and you can pay 1 generic and a red to give it +2/+0 until end of turn. The other side is Revel in Silence, which for 2 white mana is a rare instant. Your opponent can't cast spells or activate Planeswalker's loyalty abilities this turn. Exile Revel in Silence. I think most of the time you want to play this as the 2 mana 2/1, as it has a nice ability that punishes opposing activated abilities, and it can pump its own power, which makes it so it can trade for lots of stuff, or threaten to hit pretty hard on some board states. The spell side is something you'll use from time to time in really specific situations, like if you're in such a position that you know shutting down your opponent's ability to play spells for a turn will win you the game. Thing is, it's not always easy to know, but basically if they're in top deck mode and dead on board anyway, firing this off on their upkeep is some nice insurance. It's tempting to look at this and think of it as time walking your opponent, but the thing to remember is you don't really know what your opponent's doing. If they already have a good board state, the fact they can't play spells probably doesn't matter. They're just still going to attack you. And sometimes you'll use this when your opponent doesn't have the ability to play spells at all, like they're in top deck mode. So it's a highly inconsistent card, but it is one you'll use sometimes, and you sort of have to judge whether or not you think it will be valuable to use, and you're just not always going to be right about it. And that's why mostly I'd rather play the Flame Scroll side, but the other side will be useful sometimes. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Mila, Crafty Companion, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a 2/3 legendary fox at Mythic Rare. Whenever an opponent attacks 1 or more planeswalkers you control, you put a loyalty counter on each planeswalker you control. And whenever a permanent you control becomes a target of a spell or an ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. The other side is Luca, Wayward Bonder, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a legendary planeswalker Luca. He's got 5 loyalty to start with. His +1 says you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. If a creature card was discarded this way, draw 2 cards instead. His -2 says return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of your next upkeep. And he's got a -7. It says you get an emblem with whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. For limited purposes, the Mila side is mostly only that second blocks of text, but that's okay because it's a pretty good one. It basically guarantees that your opponent using a removal spell on Mila or any other creature will give you a 2-for-1. She doesn't have the most impressive stats, but that's okay with an ability like that one. It is great that you can just play Mila in the early game. The Lucasite on its own would probably be close to a bomb, if not a straight up bomb already. He does lack a straight up removal ability, but he can actually protect himself. The -2, it's kind of easy to miss because you think of haste and attacking right away, but you can actually reanimate a creature and use it to protect him. You will lose it on your next upkeep, so, it's not a permanent way of protecting himself, but if you need to do it, you can. His +1 lets you rip through your library, which is pretty nice, and you can discard things to reanimate with the -2 sometimes to set it up. And you can also get to his ultimate pretty quickly if you can keep him around, and that is the kind of ultimate that will generally win you the game within a few turns. So Luca can get pretty close to taking a game over on his own. The biggest downside about him is that he costs 6, and sometimes you won't have the time to get there. And when that's true, you can just play the also really good Mila Crafty Companion. So yeah, these two together are a bomb. I'm giving them an A. Next up, it's Plarg, Dean of Chaos, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 legendary Orc Shaman at rare. You can tap it to discard a card and draw a card, and you can pay 4 generic and a red and tap it to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary, non-land card with mana value 3 or less. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost, put all revealed cards not cast this way in the bottom of your library in a random order. The other side is Augusta, Dean of Order, which for 2 generic and a white is a 1/3 legendary human cleric. Other tap creatures you control get +1/+0. Other untap creatures you control get +0/+1. Whenever you attack, untap each creature you control, then tap any number of creatures you control. Like all the Deans, both sides of this look pretty darn good. The Plarg side can rummage, which is a pretty nice effect to have in Limited. It really helps you improve your card quality. Just a 2 mana 2/2 with that effect would be nice, but Plarg has another ability that's also pretty good, and a great late game mana sink. Sure, you end up paying 5 mana for a card that's cheaper than that, but that's perfectly fine. Once you're in top deck mode, you'll be happy to have that ability around. I think Plarg would be a great card if that's all this was. And then you have Augusta, which has a nice pump effect that really makes sure that all the creatures on your board are getting some kind of bonus. Plus, Augusta's other ability basically lets you decide which boost you want because you can untap or tap whatever creatures you want. Altogether, I think this is a very flexible and powerful card, and having these two powerful options is great. I'm giving it a B+. And our last card in this video is the red-white Mystical Archive card, which is Lightning Helix. It's a rare instant, and it says, deal 3 damage to any target and you gain 3 life. This is always a great removal spell that is super efficient. Killing something and gaining 3 at the same time can be enough to turn a game around, and you can do it very cheaply. You can also use it to finish off an opponent, which is, of course, nice upside. Basically, this is premium removal that you'll take highly, even if it is multicolored. I'm giving it a B. Those are all the Lorehold, Quandrix, and Witherbloom cards that will appear in draft boosters in Strixhaven. Tomorrow we'll be concluding the whole review by looking at the remaining 2 color pairs, as well as the colorless cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to make sure you catch the rest of this review and a lot more content, including draft videos in the very near future, don't forget to subscribe. If you're looking for the rest of this review, you should see it on your screen now. Thanks for watching.